I read, Liber Monstrorum de Diversis Generibus. This also has beautiful images, but they seem older to me. William bent his face to the text. Illuminated by Irish monks, at least 5 centuries ago. The Unicorn Book, on the other hand, is much more recent. It seems to me made in the French fashion. Once again I admired my master's erudition. We entered the next room and crossed the 4 rooms after it, all with windows, and all filled with volumes in unknown languages, in addition to some texts of occult sciences. Then we came to a wall, which forced us to turn back, because the last 5 rooms opened one into the other, with no other egress possible. To judge by the angles of the walls, I would say we are in the pentagon of another tower, William said, but there is no central heptagonal room. Perhaps we are mistaken. But what about the windows? I asked. How can there be so many windows? It is impossible for all the rooms to overlook the outside. You're forgetting the central well. Many of the windows we have seen overlook the octagon, the well. If it were day, the difference in light would tell us which are external windows and which internal, and perhaps would even reveal to us a room's position with respect to the sun. But after dusk no difference is perceptible. Let's go back. We returned to the room with the mirror and headed for the 3rd doorway, which we thought we had not gone through previously. We saw before us a sequence of 3 or 4 rooms, and toward the last we noticed a glow. Someone's there, I exclaimed in a stifled voice. If so, he has already seen our light, William said, nevertheless shielding the flame with his hand. We hesitated a moment or two. The glow continued to flicker slightly, but without growing stronger or weaker. Perhaps it is only a lamp, William said, set here to convince the monks that the library is inhabited by the souls of the dead. But we must find out. You stay here, and keep covering the light. I'll go ahead cautiously. Still ashamed at the sorry figure I had cut before the mirror, I wanted to redeem myself in William's eyes. No, I'll go, I said. You stay here. I'll proceed cautiously. I am smaller and lighter. As soon as I've made sure there is no risk, I'll call you. And so I did. I proceeded through 3 rooms, sticking close to the walls, light as a cat, or as a novice descending into the kitchen to steal cheese from the larder. An enterprise in which I excelled at milk. I came to the threshold of the room from which the glow, quite faint, was coming. I slipped along the wall to a column that served as the right jamb, and I peered into the room. No one was there. A kind of lamp was set on the table, lighted, and it was smoking, flickering. It was not a lamp like ours, it seemed, rather, an uncovered thurible. It had no flame, but a light ash smoldered, burning something. I plucked up my courage and entered. On the table beside the thurible, a brightly colored book was lying open. I approached and saw 4 strips of different colors on the page, yellow, cinnabar, turquoise, and burnt sienna. A beast was set there, horrible to see, a great dragon with 10 heads, dragging after him the stars of the sky and with his tail making them fall to earth. And suddenly I saw the dragon multiply, and the scales of his hide become a kind of forest of glittering shards that came off the page and took to circling around my head. I flung my head back and I saw the ceiling of the room bend and press down toward me. Then I heard something like the hiss of 1,000 serpents, but not frightening, almost seductive, and a woman appeared, bathed in light, and put her face to mine, breathing on me. I thrust her away with outstretched hands, and my hands seemed to touch the books in the case opposite, or to grow out of all proportion. I no longer realized where I was, where the earth was, and where the sky. In the center of the room I saw Berengar staring at me with a hateful smile, oozing lust. I covered my face with my hands and my hands seemed the claws of a toad, slimy and webbed. I cried out, I believe. There was an acid taste in my mouth. I plunged into infinite darkness, which seemed to yawn wider and wider beneath me, and then I knew nothing further. I woke again after a time I thought was centuries, hearing some blows pounding in my head. I was stretched out on the floor and William was slapping me on the cheeks. I was no longer in that room, and before my eyes was a scroll that said, Requiescant a laboribus sues, may they rest from their labors. Come, Adza, William was whispering to me. There's nothing. Everything, I said, still delirious. Over there, the beast? No beast. I found you raving underneath a table with a beautiful mosaic apocalypse on it, open to the page of the Mulier Amicta soul confronting the dragon. But I realized from the odor that you had inhaled something dangerous and I carried you away immediately. My head also aches. But what did I see? You saw nothing. The fact is that some substances capable of inducing visions were burning there. I recognized the smell. It is an Arab stuff, perhaps the same that the old man of the mountain gave his assassins to breathe before sending them off on their missions. And so we have explained the mystery of the visions. Someone puts magic herbs there during the night to convince importunate visitors that the library is guarded by diabolical presences. What did you experience, by the way? In confusion, as best I could recall, I told him of my vision, and William laughed. For half of it you were developing what you had glimpsed in the book, and for the other half you let your desires and your fears speak out. This is the operation certain herbs set in action. Tomorrow we must talk about it with Severinus. I believe he knows more than he wants us to believe. They are herbs, only herbs, requiring none of those necromantic preparations the glazier talked to us about. Herbs, mirrors, This place of forbidden knowledge is guarded by many and most cunning devices. Knowledge is used to conceal rather than to enlighten. I don't like it. A perverse mind presides over the holy defense of the library. But this has been a toilsome night. We must leave here for the present. You're distraught and you need water and fresh air. It's useless to try to open these windows, too high and perhaps closed for decades. How could they think Adelmo had thrown himself down from here? Leave, William had said. As if it were easy. We knew the library could be reached only from one tower, the eastern one. But where were we at that moment? We had completely lost our orientation. We wandered, fearing never to emerge from that place again, I, still stumbling, seized with fits of vomiting, and William, somewhat worried about me and irritated by the inadequacy of his learning. But this wandering gave us, or gave him, an idea for the following day. We would come back to the library, assuming we ever got out of it, with a charred firebrand or some other substance capable of leaving signs on the walls. To find the way out of a labyrinth, William recited, there is only one means. At every new junction, never seen before, the path we have taken will be marked with 3 signs. If, because of previous signs on some of the paths of the junction, you see that the junction has already been visited, you will make only one mark on the path you have taken. If all the apertures have already been marked, then you must retrace your steps. But if 1 or 2 apertures of the junction are still without signs, you will choose any one, making 2 signs on it. Proceeding through an aperture that bears only 1 sign, you will make 2 more, so that now the aperture bears 3. All the parts of the labyrinth must have been visited if, arriving at a junction, you never take a passage with 3 signs, unless none of the other passages is now without signs. How do you know that? Are you an expert on labyrinths? No, I am citing an ancient text I once read. And by observing this rule you get out? Almost never, as far as I know. But we will try it, all the same. And besides, within the next day or so I will have lenses and time to devote myself more to the books. It may be that where the succession of scrolls confuses us, the arrangement of the books will give us a rule. You'll have your lenses? How will you find them again? I said I'll have lenses. I'll have new ones made. I believe the glazier is eager for an opportunity of this kind, to try something new. As long as he has the right tools for grinding the bits of glass. When it comes to bits of glass, he has plenty in his workshop. As we roamed, seeking the way, suddenly, in the center of one room, I felt an invisible hand stroke my cheek, while a groan, not human and not animal, echoed in both that room and the next, as if a ghost were wandering from one to the other. I should have been prepared for the library's surprises, but once again I was terrified and leapt backward. William must have had an experience similar to mine, because he was touching his cheek as he held up the light and looked around. He raised one hand, examined the flame, which now seemed brighter, then moistened a finger and held it straight in front of him. It's clear, he said then, and showed me 2 points, on opposite walls, at a man's height. 2 narrow slits opened there, and if you put your hand to them you could feel the cold air coming from outside. Putting your ear to them, you could hear a rustling sound, as of a wind blowing outside. The library must, of course, have a ventilation system, William said. Otherwise the atmosphere would be stifling, especially in the summer. Moreover, those slits provide the right amount of humidity, so the parchments will not dry out. But the cleverness of the founders did not stop there. Placing the slits at certain angles, they made sure that on windy nights the gusts penetrating from these openings would encounter other gusts, and swirl inside the sequence of rooms, producing the sounds we have heard. Which, along with the mirrors and the herbs, increase the fear of the foolhardy who come in here, as we have, without knowing the place well. And we ourselves for a moment thought ghosts were breathing on our faces. We've realized it only now because the wind has sprung up only now. So this mystery, too, is solved. But we still don't know how to get out. As we spoke, we wandered aimlessly, now bewildered, not bothering to read the scrolls, which seemed all alike. We came into a new heptagonal room, we went through the nearby rooms, we found no exit. We retraced our steps and walked for almost an hour, making no effort to discover where we were. At a certain point William decided we were defeated. All we could do was go to sleep in some room and hope that the next day Malachi would find us. As we bemoaned the miserable end of our bold adventure, we suddenly found again the room from which the stairway descended. We fervently thanked heaven and went down in high spirits. Once we were in the kitchen, we rushed to the fireplace and entered the corridor of the ossuarium, and I swear that the deathly grin of those fleshless heads looked to me like the smiles of dear friends. We re-entered the church and came out through the north door, finally sitting down happily on the tombstones. The beautiful night air seemed a divine balm. The stars shone around us and I felt the visions of the library were far away. How beautiful the world is, and how ugly labyrinths are, I said, relieved. How beautiful the world would be if there were a procedure for moving through labyrinths, my master replied. We walked along the left side of the church, past the great door. I looked away, to avoid seeing the elders of the apocalypse, Super Thronos Viginti Quatuor, and crossed the cloister to reach the pilgrim's hospice. At the door of the building stood the abbot, staring at us sternly. I have been looking for you all night, he said to William. I did not find you in your cell, I did not find you in church. We were pursuing a trail. William said vaguely, with visible embarrassment. The abbot gave him a long look, then said in a slow and severe voice, I looked for you immediately after Compline. Berengar was not inquire. What are you telling me? William said, with a cheerful expression. In fact, it was now clear to him who had been in ambush in the scriptorium. He was not inquire at Compline, the abbot repeated, and has not come back to his cell. Matins are about to ring, and we will now see if he reappears. Otherwise I fear some new calamity. At Matins Berengar was absent. Third day. From Lauds to Prime. In which a blood-stained cloth is found in the cell of Berengar, who has disappeared, and that is all. In setting down these words, I feel weary, as I felt that night, or, rather, that morning. What can be said? After Matins the abbot sent most of the monks, now in a state of alarm, to seek everywhere, but without any result. Toward Lauds, searching Berengar's cell, a monk found under the pallet a white cloth stained with blood. He showed it to the abbot, who drew the direst omens from it. Jorge was present, and as soon as he was informed, he said, blood? As if the thing seemed improbable to him. They told Alenardo, who shook his head and said, no, no, at the third trumpet death comes by water. William examined the cloth, then said, now everything is clear. Where is Berengar? They asked him. I don't know, he answered. Aimaro heard him and raised his eyes to heaven, murmuring to Peter of Sant'Albano, typically English. Toward Prime, when the sun was already up, servants were sent to explore the toot of the cliff, all around the walls. They came back at terse, having found nothing. William told me that we could not have done any better. We had to await events. And he went to the forges, to engage in a deep conversation with Nicholas, the master glazier. I sat in church, near the central door, as the masses were said. And so I fell devoutly asleep and slept a long time, because young people seem to need sleep more than the old, who have already slept so much and are preparing to sleep for all eternity. Terce. In which Adza, in the scriptorium, reflects on the history of his order and on the destiny of books. I came out of church less tired but with my mind confused. The body does not enjoy peaceful rest except in the night hours. I went up to the scriptorium and, after obtaining Malachi's permission, began to leaf through the catalogue. But as I glanced absently at the pages passing before my eyes, I was really observing the monks. I was struck by their calm, their serenity. Intent on their work, they seemed to forget that one of their brothers was being anxiously sought throughout the grounds, and that two others had disappeared in frightful circumstances. Here, I said to myself, is the greatness of our order. For centuries and centuries men like these have seen the barbarian hordes burst in, sack their abbeys, plunge kingdoms into chasms of fire, and yet they have gone on cherishing parchments and inks, have continued to read, moving their lips over words that have been handed down through centuries and which they will hand down to the centuries to come. They went on reading and copying as the millennium approached. Why should they not continue to do so now? The day before, Benno had said he would be prepared to sin in order to procure a rare book. He was not lying and not joking. A monk should surely love his books with humility, wishing their good and not the glory of his own curiosity. But what the temptation of adultery is for laymen and the yearning for riches is for secular ecclesiastics, the seduction of knowledge is for monks. I leafed through the catalogue, and a feast of mysterious titles danced before my eyes. Quinti sereni de medicamentis, phenomena, liber Aesopi de natura animalium, liber ethici paranomi de cosmographia, libe tres quas arculfus episcopus adamnano escapente de locis sanctus ultramarinis designavit conscribendas, libellus q ili hilarianus de origin mundi, solini polyester de situ orbis terrarum et mirabilibus, almagisthus. I was not surprised that the mystery of the crimes should involve the library. For these men devoted to writing, the library was at once the celestial Jerusalem and an underground world on the border between terra incognita and Hades. They were dominated by the library, by its promises and by its prohibitions. They lived with it, for it, and perhaps against it, sinfully hoping one day to violate all its secrets. Why should they not have risked death to satisfy a curiosity of their minds, or have killed to prevent someone from appropriating a jealously guarded secret of their own? Temptations, to be sure, intellectual pride. Quite different was the scribe monk imagined by our sainted founder, capable of copying without understanding, surrendered to the will of God, writing as if praying, and praying inasmuch as he was writing. Why was it no longer so? Oh, this was surely not the only degeneration of our order. It had become too powerful, its abbots competed with kings. In ABO did I not perhaps have the example of a monarch who, with monarch's demeanor, tried to settle controversies between monarchs? The very knowledge that the abbeys had accumulated was now used as barter goods, cause for pride, motive for boasting and prestige. Just as knights displayed armor and standards, our abbots displayed illuminated manuscripts. And all the more so now, what madness, when our monasteries had also lost the leadership in learning. Cathedral schools, urban corporations, universities were copying books, perhaps more and better than we, and producing new ones, and this may have been the cause of many misfortunes. The abbey where I was staying was probably the last to boast of excellence in the production and reproduction of learning. But perhaps for this very reason, the monks were no longer content with the holy work of copying. They wanted also to produce new complements of nature, impelled by the lust for novelty. And they did not realize, as I sensed vaguely at that moment and know clearly today, now aged in years and experience, that in doing so they sanctioned the destruction of their excellence. Because if this new learning they wanted to produce were to circulate freely outside those walls, then nothing would distinguish that sacred place any longer from a cathedral school or city university. Remaining isolated, on the other hand, it maintained its prestige and its strength intact. It was not corrupted by disputation, by the quadlibetical conceit that would subject every mystery and every greatness to the scrutiny of the sick et non. There, I said to myself, are the reasons for the silence and the darkness that surround the library. It is the preserve of learning, but can maintain this learning unsullied only if it prevents its reaching anyone at all, even the monks themselves. Learning is not like a coin, which remains physically whole even through the most infamous transactions. It is, rather, like a very handsome dress, which is worn out through use and ostentation. Is not a book like that, in fact? Its pages crumble, its ink and gold turn dull, if too many hands touch it. I saw Pacificus of Tivoli, leafing through an ancient volume whose pages had become stuck together because of the humidity. He moistened his thumb and forefinger with his tongue to leaf through his book, and at every touch of his saliva those pages lost vigor. Opening them meant folding them, exposing them to the harsh action of air and dust, which would erode the subtle wrinkles of the parchment, and would produce mildew where the saliva had softened but also weakened the corner of the page. As an excessive sweetness makes the warrior flaccid and inept, this excessive possessive and curious love would make the book vulnerable to the disease destined to kill it. What should be done? Stop reading, and only preserve? Were my fears correct? What would my master have said? Nearby I saw a rubricator, Magnus of Iona, who had finished scraping his vellum with pumice stone and was now softening it with chalk, soon to smooth the surface with the ruler. Another, next to him, Rabbano of Toledo, had fixed the parchment to the desk, pricking the margins with tiny holes on both sides, between which, with a metal stylus, he was now drawing very fine horizontal lines. Soon the 2 pages would be filled with colors and shapes, the sheet would become a kind of reliquary, glowing with gems studded in what would then be the devout text of the writing. Those 2 brothers, I said to myself, are living their hours of paradise on earth. They were producing new books, just like those that time would inexorably destroy. Therefore, the library could not be threatened by any earthly force, it was a living thing. But if it was living, why should it not be open to the risk of knowledge? Was this what Benno wanted and what Venantius perhaps had wanted? I felt confused, afraid of my own thoughts. Perhaps they were not fitting for a novice, who should only follow the rules scrupulously and humbly through all the years to come, which is what I subsequently did, without asking myself further questions, while round me the world was sinking deeper and deeper into a storm of blood and madness. It was the hour of our morning meal. I went to the kitchen, where by now I had become a friend of the cooks, and they gave me some of the best morsels. Sext, in which Adza receives the confidences of Salvator, which cannot be summarized in a few words, but which cause him long and concerned meditation. As I was eating, I saw Salvator in one corner, obviously having made his peace with the cook, for he was merrily devouring a mutton pie. He ate as if he had never eaten before in his life, not letting even a crumb fall, and he seemed to be giving thanks to God for this extraordinary event. He winked at me and said, in that bizarre language of his, that he was eating for all the years when he had fasted. I questioned him. He told me of a very painful childhood in a village where the air was bad, the rains frequent, where the fields rotted while the air was polluted by deathly miasmas. There were floods, or so I understood, season after season, when the fields had no furrows and with a bushel of seed you harvested a sextary, and then the sextary was reduced to nothing. Even the overlords had white faces like the poor, although, Salvator remarked, the poor died in greater numbers than the gentry did. Perhaps, he smiled, because there were more of them. A sextary cost 15 pence, a bushel 60 pence. The preachers announced the end of the world, but Salvator's parents and grandparents remembered the same story in the past as well, so they came to the conclusion that the world was always about to end. And after they had eaten all the bird carcasses and all the unclean animals they could find, there was a rumor in the village that somebody was beginning to dig up the dead. Salvator explained with great dramatic ability, as if he were an actor, how those homini malissimi behaved, the wicked men who scrabbled with their fingers in the earth of the cemeteries the day after somebody's funeral. Yum, he said, and bit into his mutton pie, but I could see on his face the grimace of the desperate man eating the corpse. And then, not content with digging in consecrated ground, some, worse than the others, like highwaymen, crouched in the forest and took travelers by surprise. Thwack, Salvator said, holding his knife to his throat, and, Niam. And the worst among the worst accosted boys, offering an egg or an apple, and then devoured them, though, as Salvator explained to me very gravely, always cooking them first. He told of a man who came to the village selling cooked meat for a few pence, and nobody could understand this great stroke of luck, but then the priest said it was human flesh, and the man was torn to pieces by the infuriated crowd. That same night, however, one man from the village went and dug up the grave of the murdered victim and ate the flesh of the cannibal, whereupon, since he was discovered, the village put him to death, too. But Salvatore did not tell me only this tale. In broken words, obliging me to recall what little I knew of Provençal and of Italian dialects, he told me the story of his flight from his native village and his roaming about the world. And in his story I recognized many men I had already known or encountered along the road, and I now recognize many more that I have met since, so that after all this time I may even attribute to him adventures and crimes that belonged to others, before him and after him, and which now, to my tired mind, flatten out to form a single image. This, in fact, is the power of the imagination, which, combining the memory of gold with that of the mountain, can compose the idea of a golden mountain. Often during our journey I heard William mention the simple, a term by which some of his brothers denoted not only the populace but, at the same time, the unlearned. This expression always seemed to me generic, because in the Italian cities I had met men of trade and artisans who were not clerics but were not unlearned, even if their knowledge was revealed through the use of the vernacular. And, for that matter, some of the tyrants who governed the peninsula at that time were ignorant of theological learning, and medical, and of logic, and ignorant of Latin, but they were surely not simple or benighted. So I believe that even my master, when he spoke of the simple, was using a rather simple concept. But unquestionably Salvatore was simple. He came from a rural land that for centuries had been subjected to famine and the arrogance of the feudal lords. He was simple, but he was not a fool. He yearned for a different world, which, when he fled from his family's house, I gathered, assumed the aspect of the land of Cockaigne, where wheels of cheese and aromatic sausages grow on the trees that ooze honey. Driven by such a hope, as if refusing to recognize this world as a vale of tears where, as they taught me, even injustice is foreordained by Providence to maintain the balance of things, whose design often eludes us, Salvatore journeyed through various lands, from his native Montferrat toward Liguria, then up through Provence into the lands of the King of France. Salvatore wandered through the world, begging, pilfering, pretending to be ill, entering the temporary service of some lord, then again taking to the forest or the high road. From the story he told me, I pictured him among those bands of vagrants that in the years that followed I saw more and more often roaming about Europe. False monks, charlatans, swindlers, cheats, tramps and tatterdemalions, lepers and cripples, jugglers, invalid mercenaries, wandering Jews escaped from the infidels with their spirit broken, lunatics, fugitives under banishment, malefactors with an ear cut off, sodomites, and along with them ambulant artisans, weavers, tinkers, chair menders, knife grinders, basket weavers, masons, and also rogues of every stripe, forgers, scoundrels, card sharps, rascals, bullies, reprobates, recreants, frauds, hooligans, simonia cal and embezzling canons and priests, people who lived on the credulity of others, counterfeiters of bulls and papal seals, peddlers of indulgences, false paralytics who lay at church doors, vagrants fleeing from convents, relic sellers, pardoners, soothsayers and fortune tellers, necromancers, healers, bogus alms seekers, fornicators of every sort, corrupters of nuns and maidens by deception and violence, simulators of dropsy, epilepsy, hemorrhoids, gout, and sores, as well as melancholy madness. There were those who put plasters on their bodies to imitate incurable ulcerations, others who filled their mouths with a blood-colored substance to feign accesses of consumption, rascals who pretended to be weak in one of their limbs, carrying unnecessary crutches and imitating the falling sickness, scabies, buboes, swellings, while applying bandages, tincture of saffron, carrying irons on their hands, their heads swathed, slipping into the churches stinking, and suddenly fainting in the squares, spitting saliva and popping their eyes, making the nostrils spurt blood concocted of blackberry juice and vermilion, to wrest food or money from the frightened people who recalled the church fathers' exhortations to give alms. Share your bread with the hungry, take the homeless to your hearth. We visit Christ, we house Christ, we clothe Christ, because as water purges fire so charity purges our sins. Long after the events I am narrating, along the course of the Danube I saw many, and still see some, of these charlatans who had their names and their subdivisions in legions, like the devils. It was like a mire that flowed over the paths of our world, and with them mingled preachers in good faith, heretics in search of new victims, agitators of discord. It was Pope John, always fearing movements of the simple who might preach and practice poverty, who inveighed against the mendicant preachers, for, he said, they attracted the curious by raising banners with painted figures, preaching, and extorting money. Was the simoniacal and corrupt Pope right in considering the mendicant monks preaching poverty the equivalent of bands of outcasts and robbers? In those days, having journeyed a bit in the Italian peninsula, I no longer had firm opinions on the subject. I had heard of the monks of Alto Passio, who, when they preached, threatened excommunications and promised indulgences, absolved those who committed robberies and fratricides, homicides and perjury, for money. They let it be believed that in their hospital every day up to 100 masses were said, for which they collected donations, and they said that with their income they supplied dowries for 200 poor maidens. And I had heard tales of Brother Paolo Zoppo, who in the forest of Rieti lived as a hermit and boasted of having received directly from the Holy Spirit the revelation that the carnal act was not a sin. So he seduced his victims, whom he called sisters, forcing them to submit to the lash on their naked flesh, making 5 genuflections on the ground in the form of a cross, before he presented them to God and claimed from them what he called the kiss of peace. But was it true? And what link was there between these hermits who were said to be enlightened and the monks of poor life who roamed the roads of the peninsula really doing penance, disliked by the clergy and the bishops, whose vices and thefts they excoriated? From Salvador's tale, as it became mingled with the things I already knew from my own experience, these distinctions did not emerge clearly. Everything looked the same as everything else. At times he seemed to me one of those crippled beggars of Touraine who, as the story goes, took light at the approach of the miraculous corpse of Saint Martin, for they feared the saint would heal them and thus deprive them of their source of income, and the saint mercilessly saved them before they reached the border, punishing their wickedness by restoring to them the use of their limbs. At times, however, the monk's ferocious face brightened with a sweet glow as he told me how, when living among those bands, he listened to the word of the Franciscan preachers, as outcast as he was, and he understood that the poor and vagabond life he led should be taken, not as a grim necessity, but as a joyous act of dedication, and he joined penitential sects and groups whose names he could not pronounce properly and whose doctrine he defined in highly unlikely terms. I deduced that he had encountered Paterines and Waldensians, and perhaps Catharists, Arnoldists, and Humiliati, and that, roaming about the world, he had passed from one group to another, gradually assuming as a mission his vagrant state, and doing for the Lord what he had done till then for his belly. But how, and for how long? As far as I could tell, about 30 years before, he had joined a convent of Minorites in Tuscany, and there he had assumed the habit of St. Francis, without taking orders. There, I believe, he learned that smattering of Latin he spoke, mixing it with the speech of all the places where he had been as a poor homeless wanderer, and of all the vagabond companions he had encountered, from the mercenaries of my lands to the bogomils of Dalmatia. In the convent he had devoted himself to a life of penance, he said, penitenziagite, he quoted to me, with eyes shining, and I heard again the expression that had aroused William's curiosity. But apparently also the monks he was staying with had confused ideas, because, enraged by the canon of the neighboring church, who was accused of thefts and other wickedness, they invaded his house one day and sent him flying down the steps, and the sinner died. Then they looted his house. For which the bishop sent his armed guards, the monks were dispersed, and Salvador roamed at length in northern Italy with a band of fraticelli, or mendicant Minorites, at this point without any law or discipline. From there he took refuge in the Toulouse region, and a strange adventure befell him, for he was inflamed by hearing the story of the Crusaders' great enterprises. A horde of shepherds and humble folk in great numbers gathered one day to cross the sea and fight against the enemies of the faith. They were called the Pastoro, the shepherds. Actually, they wanted to escape their own wretched land. There were 2 leaders, who filled their heads with false theories, a priest who had been dismissed from his church because of his conduct, and an apostate monk of the order of St. Benedict. This pair drove ignorant men so mad that they came running after the 2 in throngs, even boys of 16, against their parents' wishes, carrying only knapsack and stick, all without money, leaving their fields, to follow the leaders like a flock, and they formed a great crowd. At this point they would no longer heed reason or justice, but only power and their own caprice. Gathered together and finally free, with a dim hope of promised lands, they were as if drunk. They stormed through villages and cities, taking everything, and if one of their number was arrested, they would attack the prison and free him. And they killed all the Jews they came upon here and there and stripped them of their possessions. Why the Jews? I asked Salvatore. He answered, and why not? He explained to me that all his life preachers had told him the Jews were the enemies of Christianity and accumulated possessions that had been denied the Christian poor. I asked him, however, whether it was not also true that lords and bishops accumulated possessions through tithes, so that the shepherds were not fighting their true enemies. He replied that when your true enemies are too strong, you have to choose weaker enemies. I reflected that this is why the simple are so called. Only the powerful always know with great clarity who their true enemies are. The lords did not want the shepherds to jeopardize their possessions, and it was a great good fortune for them that the shepherds' leaders spread the notion that the greatest wealth belonged to the Jews. I asked him who had put into the crowd's head the idea of attacking the Jews. Salvatore could not remember. I believe that when such crowds collect, lured by a promise and immediately demanding something, there is never any knowing who among them speaks. I recalled that their leaders had been educated in convents and cathedral schools, and they spoke the language of the lords, even if they translated it into terms that the shepherds could understand. The shepherds did not know where the Pope was, but they knew where the Jews were. Anyway, they laid siege to a high and massive tower of the King of France, where the frightened Jews had run in a body to take refuge. And the Jews sallying forth below the walls of the tower defended themselves courageously and pitilessly, hurling wood and stones. But the shepherds set fire to the gate of the tower, tormenting the barricaded Jews with smoke and flames. And the Jews, unable to defeat their attackers, preferring to kill themselves rather than die at the hand of the uncircumcised, asked one of their number, who seemed the most courageous, to put them all to the sword. He consented, and killed almost 500 of them. Then he came out of the tower with the children of the Jews, and asked the shepherds to baptize him. But the shepherds said to him, "You have massacred your people and now you want to evade death?" And they tore him to pieces, but they spared the children, whom they baptized. Then they headed for Carcassonne, carrying out many bloody robberies along the way. Then the King of France warned them that they had gone too far and ordered that they be resisted in every city they passed through, and he proclaimed that even the Jews should be defended as if they were the king's men. Why did the king become so considerate of the Jews at that point? Perhaps because he was beginning to realize what the shepherds might do throughout the kingdom, and he was concerned because their number was increasing too rapidly. Further, he was moved to tenderness for the Jews, both because the Jews were useful to the trade of the kingdom, and because now it was necessary to destroy the shepherds, and all good Christians had to have a good reason to weep over their crimes. But many Christians did not obey the king, thinking it wrong to defend the Jews, who had always been enemies of the Christian faith. And in many cities the humble people, who had to pay usury to the Jews, were happy to see the shepherds punish them for their wealth. Then the king commanded, under pain of death, that no aid be given the shepherds. He gathered a considerable army and attacked them, and many of them were killed, while others saved themselves by taking flight and seeking refuge in the forests, but there they died of hardship. Soon all were annihilated. The king's general captured them and hanged them, 20 or 30 at a time, from the highest trees, so the sight of their corpses would serve as an eternal example and no one would dare to disturb the peace of the realm again. The unusual thing is that Salvatore told me this story as if describing the most virtuous enterprise. And in fact he remained convinced that the home of so-called shepherds had aimed to conquer the sepulchre of Christ and free it from the infidels, and it was impossible for me to convince him that this fine conquest had already been achieved, in the days of Peter the Hermit and Saint Bernard, and under the reign of Saint Louis of France. In any case, Salvatore did not reach the infidels because he had to leave French territory in a hurry. He went into the Novara region, he told me, but he was very vague about what happened at this point. And finally he arrived at Casale, where he was received by the convent of Minorites, and here I believe he met Remigio, at the very time when many of them, persecuted by the Pope, were changing habit in them, refuge in monasteries of other orders, to avoid being burned at the stake. As, indeed, Ubertino had told us. Thanks to his long familiarity with many manual tasks, which he had performed both for dishonest purposes, when he was roaming freely, and for holy purposes, when he was roaming for the love of Christ, Salvatore was immediately taken on by the cellarer as his personal assistant. And that was why he had been here for many years, with scant interest in the order's pomp, but much to the administration of its cellar and larder, where he was free to eat without stealing and to praise the Lord without being burned. I looked at him with curiosity, not because of the singularity of his experience, but because what had happened to him seemed to me the splendid epitome of so many events and movements that made the Italy of that time fascinating and incomprehensible. What had emerged from those tales? The picture of a man who had led an adventurous life, capable even of killing a fellow man without realizing his own crime. But although at that time one offense to the divine law seemed to me the same as another, I was already beginning to understand some of the phenomena I was hearing discussed, and I saw that it is one thing for a crowd, in an almost ecstatic frenzy, mistaking the laws of the devil for those of the Lord, to commit a massacre, but it is another thing for an individual to commit a crime in cold blood, with calculation, in silence. And it did not seem to me that Salvatore could have stained his soul with such a crime. On the other hand, I wanted to discover something about the abbot's insinuations, and I was obsessed by the idea of Fra Dolcino, of whom I knew almost nothing, though his ghost seemed to hover over many conversations I had heard these past few days. So I asked Salvatore point blank, "In your journeys did you ever meet Fra Dolcino?" His reaction was most strange. He widened his eyes, if it were possible to open them wider than they were, he blessed himself repeatedly, murmured some broken phrases in a language that this time I really did not understand. But they seemed to me phrases of denial. Until then he had looked at me with good-natured trust, I would say with friendship. At that moment he looked at me almost with irritation. Then, inventing an excuse, he left. Now I could no longer resist. Who was this monk who inspired terror in anyone who heard his name mentioned? I decided I could not remain any longer in the grip of my desire to know. An idea crossed my mind. Ubertino. He himself had uttered that name, the first evening we met him. He knew everything of the vicissitudes, open and secret, of monks, friars, and other species of these last years. Where could I find him at this hour? Surely in church, immersed in prayer. And since I was enjoying a moment of liberty, I went there. I did not find him, indeed, I did not find him until evening. And so my curiosity stayed with me, for other events were occurring, of which I must now tell. Nuns. In which William speaks to Adza of the great river of heresy, of the function of the simple within the church, of his doubts concerning the possibility of knowing universal laws. And almost parenthetically he tells how he deciphered the necromantic signs left by Venantius. I found William at the forge, working with Nicholas, both deeply involved in their task. On the counter they had laid out a number of tiny glass discs, perhaps originally intended as parts of a window. With instruments they had reduced some of these to the desired thickness. William was holding them up before his eyes, testing them. Nicholas, for his part, was issuing instructions to the smiths for making the fork in which the correct lenses would be set. William was grumbling, irritated because so far the most satisfactory lens was an emerald color, and, as he said, he did not want parchments to seem meadows to him. Nicholas went off to supervise the smiths. As William tried out the various discs, I told him of my dialogue with Salvatore. The man has had various experiences, he said. Perhaps he actually was with the Dulcinians. The abbey really is a microcosm, and when we have Pope John's envoys and Brother Michael here, we'll be complete. Master, I said to him, I understand nothing. About what, Adza? First, about the differences among heretical groups. But I'll ask you about that later. Now I am tormented by the problem of difference itself. When you were speaking with Uberdino, I had the impression you were trying to prove to him that all are the same, saints and heretics. But then, speaking with the abbot, you were doing your best to explain to him the difference between one heretic and another, and between the heretical and the orthodox. In other words, you reproached Uberdino for considering different those who were basically the same, and the abbot for considering the same those who were basically different. William set the lenses on the table for a moment. My good Adza, he said, we will try now to make some distinctions, and we may as well use the terms of the school of Paris for our distinguishing. So, they say all men have the same substantial form, am I right? Of course, I said, proud of my knowledge, men are animals but rational, and the property of man is the capacity for laughing. Excellent. But Thomas is different from Bonaventure. Thomas is fat while Bonaventure is thin, and it may even be that Hugh is bad while Francis is good, and Aldemar is phlegmatic while Agilulf is bilious. Or am I mistaken? No, that is the case, beyond any doubt. Then this means there is identity in different men as to their substantial form, and diversity as to the accidents, or as to their superficial shape. That is so, unquestionably. When I say to Uberdino that human nature itself, in the complexity of its operations, governs both the love of good and the love of evil, I am trying to convince Uberdino of the identity of human nature. When I say to the abbot, however, that there is a difference between a Catharist and a Waldensian, I am insisting on the variety of their accidents. And I insist on it because a Waldensian may be burned after the accidents of a Catharist have been attributed to him, and vice versa. And when you burn a man you burn his individual substance and reduce to pure nothing that which was a concrete act of existing, hence in itself good, at least in the eyes of God, who kept